Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. It's terrifying because I can't bullshit anybody in the room. I'm a photographer, so for me, the opportunity to photograph Steve Jobs, it wasn't about technology. I had actually come back from covering the famine in Africa, in Ethiopia, and was looking for something more hopeful for the human race. And Steve had just been forced out at Apple, and he said he was going to do this supercomputer for education. And that was, as a photojournalist, that made sense to me. I had covered education issues. So I thought, well, here's this avatar for a new generation. He changed the world a couple times already, why not? So I approached him through friends and asked if I could document his process, him with his team building this next computer from inception to shipping. And I had studied visual anthropology, and I wanted to create more of a database of information, if you will, photographically. But then I asked him if I could do it for Life magazine. And it was the craziest thing, because I said, I want complete access, and I want copyright. And I'm going to put it in Life magazine. And he said yes. What I didn't know is that Steve, being Steve, already had the idea. I was just in the right place at the right time. He had already had a video crew in. But it was an amazing opportunity to be able to document a group of brilliant, amazing people trying to build something amazing that even I could see potentially could be world-changing. And it did change the world in a number of ways. And the World Wide Web was invented on an X computer.
So, like, when would this have been, if you can remember, like, year-wise?
I started approaching in '85. And then I went down there, I think, in December of '85, if I'm not mistaken, and met with Steve. Susan Kerr and Dana Lewin were my guides in.
Susan Kerr, who is at the Layers conference this week. I don't know if she spoke today or not, but Susan Kerr did all the, she was the original icon designer on the Macintosh project, right? Am I getting that correct?
Yes, she designed the icons for the Mac. She affects millions of people every day.
And she was, for those of you who know, she was Keith Olf's mentor. She was the person who brought Keith Olf's, who did all the graphic design for NeXTEVNT.
Right. And she also then went on to redesign Windows for Bill Gates, asked her to come in and redesign the Windows icons and OS2. She left Next to go to General Magic and did many, many other OSs. But no, I started shooting in earnest. I think I shot a little bit in the fall of '85, but I really started getting underway in '86. And, you know, it was like a classic startup. They had original funding from Steve, but then he got Russ Bro to come in and give him $20 million. And he told Russ he was going to build the world's most advanced assembly line with robots. But it was really more interesting to me to see how you organize a group of people to do something impossible on a ridiculous deadline. And, you know, he was the most inspiring person I ever met, despite the scars I have to show for having worked there for 3 years.
Well, I think many of us have various scars, so perhaps we should talk about some scar tissue. But I mean, were there things that, so you're trying, so this is an interesting thing, right? Think about this. So you've got somebody who wants to tell a story, and they find somebody who also wants to tell a story, and you have a story that's beginning to evolve in your head. Were there times where you could see, you know, whether it's Steve or somebody that you were trying to shoot some stuff in, and they were like, no, not right now?
You know, that only happened once at Next in the 3 years that I was really working hard there. I think it was Stephen Wolfram.
Yeah, I believe that.
Who didn't know me and didn't know who I was and what I was doing there. And I think
what are you doing here?
Yeah, he panicked. It was like, who let the photographer in here? You know? But I was kind of a guinea pig for a lot of people. They would ask, you know, I was like any idiot. And sometimes they would call me over and say, does this make sense? Some of the OS guys would ask me to try things. But, you know, I had been photographing conflict and the drug wars in Oakland and the AIDS crisis and the homeless crisis and politics and celebrities. My friends thought I was an idiot to go to Silicon Valley. What the hell? These people are staring at computer screens under fluorescent light. Why would you want to shoot that? And, you know, I knew it was going to be tough because I had been in the room and I had seen it. But once you got down there and you talked to people, you realized this was a hidden tribe that was inventing a new culture. to go with this new technology. And it was happening very, very quickly. It was this hippie generation coming in and merging with the space race generation. So the culture was changing. The nature of work was changing. So if you spent 5 minutes there and you looked at the technology that was coming, you could see that they had this power. And it was almost irresponsible not to document it, not to create a record of it. Plus, photojournalists want to change the world just like you guys. We want to take pictures that mean something. And, that hadn't quite happened for me yet, but I realized I could photograph you guys and create a record of that. These are the people that were changing the world. So that was my purpose. That was useful.
And so because that's sort of the stereotype, right? Is it's a bunch of people looking at a screen, right? And I'm assuming, and I wasn't there. I wasn't I wasn't ever at Next, but I was involved in the Next community in probably the late 80s is about when I slotted in. I was at the Media Lab 87, 88 kind of thing and dropped into it there. And my experience of that stuff is they tend to be a lot of people who are arguing. I mean, the writing of the code happens once you've had lots of arguments, but was that,
Well, I would cruise the halls like a shark just for hours, looking for some sign of human behavior. Emoting, and this is what I would love with these arguments. The best arguments were between product marketing managers and engineers. Those are my favorite meetings because you're figuring out the features and what you could really ship and when. And what I also loved about that was when it became more diverse and the arguments started, the worldview changed. And as a user, I found that as a beta tester, I think the product changed, the more diverse the group around the table got. But in terms of the strategy, it was a lot of meetings and a lot of solitude, and then there would be gatherings and there would be like hallway stuff. I loved hallways. People would bump into each other in hallways. The whole design of Pixar and that whole stuff. Well, that was being worked out at Next, actually, because he was noticing, and I noticed that. In fact, I would run into, like Ross Perot was left all by himself walking around the halls. Steve would let him cool his heels, and I got to talk to Russ. I walked up to him one day and asked him for advice. And I said, Russ, I'm thinking of starting my own business. What do you think? And he goes, well, son, when I started my business, the only people that would invest were my wife and my mother. That's why equity. Equity, son, equity. That's why I have $3 billion. But the hallways were great because people would have these offline conversations, and then the arguments were great. They also had a place at Next, I think it was at Deer Creek before Redwood City, that was called Silicon Beach. And there was a room. Right. There was a room that was Deer Creek. Okay, so it led out onto a roof where we actually did a group shot once. But what you started to see were different communities that would act in different ways, between the engineering and marketing and finance. And Steve would bop around through all these things. And by the way, he gave me complete access. I would walk into his office and just sit there and listen to him talking on the phone, pitching or trying to get money or whatever he was doing. And he didn't seem to care. So it was like auditing an MBA class on how you start a company. It was amazing. And I would shoot term sheets over the shoulder of people in meetings and stuff. It was amazing. I have this. Well, it hasn't been scanned yet. Well,
so let's jump ahead and let's talk about this book and sort of how what happened to those pictures? Why did we only start seeing these pictures 2 years ago or so?
Well, after Steve killed the life story, after 3 years of work,
there you go.
After 3 years of work,
final cut, ladies and gentlemen.
it was a heartbreak because I had it was a career changer for me. I had a cover and 8 pages laid out. But at the beginning in '85, Steve loved Life magazine. Everyone did. It was still an important cultural.
It was big.
Yeah, it was big. It was the most important magazine in America. By '88, when they launched, it had gone so far downhill. It was incredible. And I asked Steve. I actually said, "What the fuck?" And he said to me, don't worry about it, Doug. He goes, you'll have fun with these pictures someday. And that's when I became a Buddhist.
The long view.
I had to let go of desire. But no, I had a kind of an out-of-body experience. Looking at him telling me this, I kind of let go, and I kind of said, I could see he was right. I literally let go of ego, and I just moved on, and I went out into the valley. I had become obsessed with this story, with these people, And I ended up shooting for 15 years, over 70 companies, 250,000 eggs. Stanford, I put it in boxes in 2000. When the dot-com collapsed, the bubble collapsed, it shifted from this noble cause that Steve used to talk about when he would have these pep talks. And there was this raw idealism you can't quantify in a business plan that was happening in the Valley in the 80s. By the end of the 90s, that shifted into this whole gold rush that was unsustainable, and it was actually not compelling. It was just no longer interesting. I was burned out, ended up selling my house in Mill Valley and moving to New York, put the stuff in my garage and in my barn, and then Stanford called, the library, and they acquired the collection. They haven't paid for it yet. But they acquired the collection in 2004. In 2008, they came to me and said, we can't get any money. We want to make this a resource for engineers, students, scholars, and historians. Can you go to your rich friends in Silicon Valley and get them money?
Because we've all got rich friends that are just going to fund random shit we want to do.
And I'm like,
I help run a museum, you know? Yeah, hey, this is not as easy as it sounds.
fundraising isn't so easy. No. Well, I did raise money by selling part of the archive copyright. And I raised a couple $1 million, which we put into scanning, and that's why you're seeing the book. It took years to figure out how to get the film out of boxes, what's good, what should we scan. But out of the 250,000, we've only got 7,000 done. But that got us the book. So the book is phase one, and it's exhibits that are touring the world. Now we're creating a nonprofit for education to try and create learning materials, and we're doing the documentary, and we are raising money continuously to do that. So you will see a lot more of them. We did Adobe for 4 years. I went to John Scully at Apple, and he let me do the Newton team for 2 years with complete access, which was a very sad story. And I did Kleiner Perkins for 6 years. They let me shoot while they were funding Amazon. Jeff Bezos practiced his pitch, and my wife and I going up Aspen Mountain.
Wow.
I did Netscape. I did, so many companies, a lot of biotech. The last company I shot at the end was called NetObjects, which you may recall. And they were an amazing story because they were the first commercial software that let anybody make their own web page. And that was very important, I think, in terms of that internet inflection point, 95, 96. But they were also the first company that closed flat. They did their IPO in March of 99, and it actually dipped lower than they opened. And CNN came on and said, is this the beginning of the end of the dot-com bubble? And it was. And a year later, IBM took the company public. And they sold the company in March of 99, and then they took the company public March of 98, and then they took it public in March of 99. And every IPO after that point was flat or low until March of 2000 when it all...
Well, and it's interesting with that stuff, right? Because so you were there for sort of this 10-year...
15 years.
15 years. And so I remember being at the Media Lab at MIT in the late 80s, early 90s, and I was there a long time. And there was a new crew of students coming in. This is in probably 94. And Nicholas Negroponte was welcoming the new students in, and he said... he said to them, "Why are you here?" And they were all like, and he said, "You see them?" And there was a bunch of us. There was like 2 rows of us in the back, and we were there. We were there for the food because we were grad students. And he goes, "You see them? They've been here for a long time. They came here because no one else would have them. They came here because they had things they wanted to do that they thought they could do here, which they're doing. They didn't come here to make any money. I think you people have come here to make money." It's this whole thing, right? There's this weird transition there.
I don't think people realize today the sacrifices that were made in the 80s and 90s, the level of passion, because so much was unknown. Yeah, you were building on the shoulders of giants and everybody that came before in the 70s and all that, but this was the first time you had so much innovation in such a short period of time without a crisis like Sputnik or World War II.
Yeah.
It was a very unusual thing. And John Doerr says there were more jobs and wealth created than any time in human history, and I believe him, because so much changed. In fact, we're at the end of that wave that started then, right? Everything is maturing now. The stack is getting integrated as
Well, but you said the right word, right? The whole gold rush mentality there, which is again there was no exit plan back then.
No, but the sad thing is that was institutionalized in 2000. The gold rush was institutionalized. So now, if you're a young entrepreneur and you want to do hard science or something crazy that'll take longer than 24 months or 18 months, you won't get funding for tough problems unless you're a government grant or maybe you're inside Google or some big company like Apple. You can't do tough stuff. You can do short-term things. That's not the same as what happened then.
Right.
That's a small game comparative to what people were trying to do in the 80s and 90s, and most of the time they failed. I mean, my book shouldn't be called Fearless Genius. It should be called Failure, because of the 70 companies, most of them failed.
But the funny part about that, of course, is that the people who were there ended up mattering a lot, right?
They did, and that's what's really exciting. I was being negative before, but now let me be positive, because there's a new wave coming, and it's exciting, and we're in the lull between waves. And believe me, I know nothing. I'm a photographer, but it looks to me like all this stuff, nanotech, 3D printing, genomics, all these cool things that are percolating. None of them have scaled yet because of Moore's law, probably, and funding. But it'll probably happen. The next wave is coming, and it's going to be, they say we're at the knee of Moore's law, and it's going to be exponential. I spent a day with Ray Kurzweil talking about this. He finally said, I can't talk to you anymore. You don't have a doctorate in computer science, and
Ray's
your questions are irritating.
I have a doctorate. I can say Ray's a dick, okay?
But anyway, Ray thinks it's going to be exponential, and computing processor speeds will go hand in hand with the amount of transistors. No, Bill Joy disagrees. It may not happen. Anyway, exciting stuff is coming, but you have to have that intangible, that passion. You have to be willing to die for your idea. That's what I observed. And people did die. People I photographed killed themselves or drove their cars into trees. It was just different because they wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. So we're getting to a point where you'll have that opportunity at this next wave.
Yay.
But we need somehow to create a change in the culture to show people there's more to life than short-term stuff. This is about the whole goal of my book. The whole point of my book as an observer became, what is worth doing? What the fuck are you doing with your life? Because that's what you're going to get to anyway when you're our age.
Yeah, it's the thing that Steve always said to us at Pixar was, if we do our job right, these movies will outlast us.
Exactly.
And sadly and obviously, they're outlasting Steve. But hopefully they'll. I mean, that's part of the point of doing this event in the first place. Frankly, was. A gentleman who was doing his PhD at Cornell in technology history called me up and said, I'm doing my dissertation on history of technology and I want to talk about NeXTEVNT. And so he's like, can I come visit you and talk to you? And so we talked for 2.5 hours, and I realized all I had done was given him vectors. I was like, you should talk to Mike Hawley. You should talk to Peter Graffagnino. You should talk to Guido Quaroni. You should talk to all these other people, kind of thing. And I realized that there were all these people that were doing, to Will's point, right? Of this stuff came from a place, right? And there's a through line in it. And sometimes the through line gets lost. And so hopefully,
without history, you have no future. That's another thing. Nobody in the Valley wants to study history.
Yeah.
I asked some young engineers, do you know who Bob Noyce is? And they were brilliant, talented young engineers. And I just off the top of my head asked, I don't know why, 30 years old, didn't know who Bob Noyce was. How do I even know who Bob Noyce is?
Well, and
you got to have the through line to go forward. Because there's stuff that's relevant. People don't think this, but there's stuff that's relevant that happened then that will help us now go forward to the next.
Yeah. And so I think that is a good transition to our next interview.
I just want to say one more thing.
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned that the films outlasted Steve, and when we were looking at the cube, the prototype, I offhandedly asked Steve what he thought he was going to accomplish with this cube. What do you want to do with this? And he looked at me and he said, I want some kid at Stanford to cure cancer in his dorm room.
Yeah,
it could have happened.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. My original experience of Peter was our mutual friend Bruce Blumberg, who was employee number 7, the first employee after the founders of Next, who told me I needed to meet Peter because he was the guy that could answer the annoying questions that I was asking Bruce about anti-aliasing and various type rendering things and stuff like that. And so my initial memory of Peter was he was the guy with Leo Horvitz who wrote Display PostScript. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, I mean, more or less. Leo and Jack Newland were really the first guys, and you see a lot of pictures of them in Doug's photography. And they worked with Adobe on the first 2-bit version, and that was probably 88 through 89. I actually went to developer camp in 88, and I was working at a company called Island Graphics up in San Rafael on PostScript and pre-press stuff. And I saw what they were doing, and I was like, this is really cool. They're bringing PostScript and window system graphics together and doing some interesting stuff. So I ended up getting to know Leo through Pixar connections, and they hired me into Next in 1990, which was just after launch and just when we were working on the NeXTStation Color. So we were getting into the kind of the 4-bit color, 12-bit color stuff, and kind of NeXTDimension was also going on at that point. So I was kind of, they had already done the groundwork, and I was kind of, PostScript level 2, the next step after, because I think Leo went skiing or something after.
Yes, Leo is one to do that, yes.
So Leo left me in charge in about 91 or 92.
Oh yeah, talk about the because now I'm remembering of all the, because you were always the go-to guy for there were all these weird graphics cards that there was a specific bus that you guys were going to have to spec to do the thing, and I always felt like you were chasing some piece of technology that was just over the edge to do it on a PC.
Yeah, there was, NeXTDimension was a project that we worked on a lot, which was the first true color 24-bit frame buffer with an i860 processor and a lot of.
Only ran in the NeXTCube, right? It was a big.
It was a big 1 foot by 1 foot board, and we had to do a lot of stuff to kind of divide PostScript so that part of it was running on the 860 and part of it was running on the host, and it was a bunch of crazy stuff. But I remember one of the guys, I think it might have been Mike Paquette, who I think talked with you guys last year.
Yeah, Mike was here last year. Yeah. It's his computer is the NeXTStation Color Turbo over there. You can see his business card in the back.
We got our NeXTDimension up and running, and we're dragging around a window on the screen, of course, opaque drag, which was a big deal in those days. And Mike looked at me and he said, "Do you know we're dragging around 4 megabytes worth of data in real time?" It was like, oh my God. Of course, these days it's like, well, whatever. But it was a big deal. We were doing some stuff that kind of pushed the envelope, and we were always looking for that next increment in terms of processing speed and acceleration. And they spent a long time trying to figure out how to do an accelerator for display PostScript, and nothing really worked out extremely well because of the intricacy of 2D rendering versus 3D rendering, and that kind of has a long history of trying to get things accelerated with graphics chips, which finally we cracked at Apple with doing the compositing Windows Server and stuff like that. But it was a long thread of technology. And what I was going to say about the final days of Next was it was really kind of depressing because we could see, Next machines had failed, NeXTSTEP for PA RISC, for DEC, for all these, IBM had failed. NeXTSTEP for Intel was not going well. NeXTSTEP for Windows, which worked embarrassingly well, was also not going very well. So the company had kind of shifted to this web objects focus and kind of moving away. So those of us who were like OS geeks were like, well, what are we going to do? Time to move on. And a lot of people did. But there was a core of us, Avi, Bertrand, me, a bunch of others who kind of, Mike, who hung out there, and thank God for the Apple acquisition, because we all got to kind of bring all the technology to the world. So that worked out cool.
Well, that was.
And a lot of us didn't want to go. We were like, I don't want to go work at Apple. Don't make me work on Mac OS.
Well, that's the funny thing of where I remember. I remember the first WWDC, which was the first one that I went to, and it was the one where, and it was just, this will tell you guys how different of a time it was. I walked in there, I had no special access, I had nothing there. It was before the keynote started, and so everybody was just milling up in the front, okay? And so I saw Avi, and and maybe, I don't know if this is 98 or 99, but it was something of where there was like an actual thing that like, there was Objective-C code that I could write and compile kind of thing in there.
Yeah, that was probably the first WWDC after the acquisition.
Yeah, and so
98 maybe.
And so I walked up there and I saw Avi, and he turns around and he sees me and he goes, "What are you doing here?" And I had. I had whatever it was. So that there was the black PowerBook. Whatever the black PowerBook was. Yeah, right? And so I had that black PowerBook, and I pull it out of my backpack, and I said, well, I heard the inmates are running the asylum, and so I thought I'd come check it out. And he's like, all right, well, have a seat. I hope you enjoy it. And then that was the same WWC where they had a panel, folks. Some of you will not believe this, but they had a panel which was Ask the Vice Presidents.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember that.
And it was literally like Avi, and I don't forget whoever else was in a VP, but like one of the questions was, will you ship terminal? Right? Like these were the sorts of questions like that, because the Mac people in the room were like, if you ship terminal, you're dead to me.
Very anti-command line. Yeah.
You are dead to me. Yeah. But so talk about that, because there's this interesting transition of where a lot of the people that I knew at Next were, because I'm a failed electrical engineer. My undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering, and I changed majors at the last moment so I wouldn't actually be academically seen as competent to design hardware, because I hated designing hardware. But all these people that I knew at Next were these people that I kind of wanted to be, which is that they deeply understood hardware, even though they were kind of coming at it from a software perspective. And then you guys transitioned into being just a software company, and that was what got bought by Apple. But then there was this transition of, again, kind of you guys figuring out like the compositing, like that Windows server. I mean, you figured out ways of doing stuff that it was very high performance, and people didn't get it for the longest time. So talk about that, because you were there.
Yeah, the transition from display PostScript to, Quartz and core graphics was kind of. It actually had started a little bit before the Apple transition, because Adobe was moving away from PostScript, and they were moving to PDF and doing more stuff with client-side libraries rather than this big language. I mean, PostScript is it's a graphics library. It's also a complete language environment, with a interpreter and a VM and all that stuff. And I think everyone kind of realized that design wasn't going to last. So we were exploring client-side graphics with a library that eventually came Core Graphics at Next. And when we came to Apple, we kind of figured out that we really can't have a centralized Windows server that's running PostScript. Of course, there were licensing issues with Adobe also, which is a whole other story. But what we really want is just a lightweight windowing kernel that can distribute events and create backing stores for Windows, and then let the apps draw with whatever client-side API they wanted, because we knew we had to support quick draw apps. We obviously wanted to support PDF-style drawing with Core Graphics, OpenGL, or video rendering, which a lot of that was in software in those days. So you really wanted high-performance access to the window backing store. So that's one of the changes we made when we went to OS 10, is we kind of divided the Windows server and put the rendering library in the client address space, and the windowing server remained just a very simple, lightweight kind of event distribution and memory storage for the backing stores. And then, once we had all the backing stores, we started to innovate on that end to say, well, now that we have a backing store for every window, let's think about compositing in real time. Graphics cards were just starting to come out with alpha blending and transparency. Unfortunately, we weren't able to use them in the first few releases of NeXTSTEP, but one of the guys, Ralph Brunner, who I think is still at Apple, wrote some really cool code that would analyze the screen and tile it into little areas, and would have little high-performance blitz to blend the Aqua user interface for the drop shadows and all of that stuff. So when we were able to unveil Aqua and all that stuff with translucent drop shadows, anti-aliasing even on the window edges, and anti-alias text and all that stuff. That was really kind of a departure point for moving to a more modern API. And we kind of knew that was the look we wanted. We knew we couldn't quite do it in hardware yet, but that eventually came over time and kind of never looked back.
Well, and the other thing that I remember talking to you a lot about high DPI stuff. I don't know, probably 5-6 years before it ever actually showed up as anything that mattered in terms of Retina displays. So talk about like how far ahead did you guys see? Was that just completely obvious that that was going to happen? Or?
Well, not really, because display technology is very expensive and requires a lot of investment and really high resolution displays. They had a few of them for like pre-press, but they were very, very expensive. So we weren't.
If I can just jump in there, because I remember back at the lab, we had a 300
DPI.
300 DPI, that kind of grayscale one that was a pre-press thing, and then we had these 200 DPI Sony ones that they used for air traffic control, and that was batshit crazy stuff back in the early 90s. So.
Yeah, no, it wasn't clear it was going to happen, but what we talked about anti-aliasing of text a lot, and we got a lot of heat in the early days of OS 10 because the text was a little bit blurry and maybe not as good as you want it. But I was against hinting. I really didn't want to go to binary text rendering and true type hints and all that stuff, and just have that crappy bitmap look. I wanted the graphics on my computer to look as good as graphics you'd see in a movie or on TV. And obviously it was going to happen eventually. The question was how to get there. So we took some heat, and this was with Steve's blessing and everything, that the type rendering in the early versions of OS 10 was a little bit blurry, and then we did a few kind of tweaks to to pixel cracks and stuff like that. But we never did a full-blown hinted or bitmap implementation. And we always thought that the reason why this is good to do, because eventually we're going to have high-resolution displays and you'll never notice. And I'm so glad, finally, we took a while, but, we got there with high DPI, and, it does make some simplifying assumptions, like it's a factor of 2, because you kind of want to map pixel cracks to pixel cracks, otherwise you can get into some problems. But eventually, we had to kind of wait for the technology almost to give you a factor of 2 in each dimension before you could really do it well without breaking apps and having people try to scroll half a pixel, which doesn't work too well. But so anyway, so that it was kind of the thing that's neat about it all, though, is it's a continuous refinement of basically the same design, and it's not just at the graphics level, but the OS level, the frameworks level. It's pretty gratifying to see. How many years has it been, since...
Dude, let's not talk about that.
25, 30 years of...
yeah.
Kind of, you can squint, and everything kind of fits where
What do you
it
mean
used to.
you could squint? I do squint all the time, okay? So I have glasses, okay?
And yeah, this module, this subsystem was rewritten. We threw out display PostScript, but we kept the imaging model. We kept all the advantages with PDF instead of PostScript. And yeah, we do some fancier compositing now than we used to be able to. But basically, the design worked. And I think this is something that I think Steve learned at Next in terms of lessons. Everything I read about Next say that was a failed company, and that kind of pisses me off. But I think what Steve learned at Next is that investment in software lasts a lot longer than investment in hardware or factories.
General purpose hardware will always, hey dude, I worked at Thinking Machines, okay? General purpose hardware will always defeat special purpose hardware because it's the software that matters.
And those designs that we did and the OS guys did at Avi and Mach and all of that stuff, it was very forward thinking, kind of risky. Let's do display PostScript on a desktop machine, or let's do a Mach VM, and you can allocate as much memory as you want, and we'll just swap it. Things like that were really some bets in the day, but really have withstood the test of time. And I think that was a lesson Steve learned about when you can control the software, you can run. So.
Is there anything, if you look back, is there anything from sort of back in the day in the early 90s kind of thing that like you still feel hasn't landed yet? Video stuff, 3D stuff, I feel like, color managed imagery is almost sort of in many ways there. High deep, but anything?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think. I don't know. I mean, the use of 3D and user interfaces has been debated back and forth, and it never really kind of went anywhere. It was some of the stuff when we did core animation, which was originally called Layer Kit, of trying to put elements in 3D planes in space, and some of the early demos of that were like menus in space and stuff like that. And I always thought that would. Because you see a lot of that on TV and television graphics and credits and movies and stuff. And I always thought there would be more of that happening than has. But that's really the only thing that I have thought about. But if I gave it some more thought, I could probably come up with some other things.
All right. Well, that's thank you, Peter.
Sure.
That was awesome.
Great. Thanks.
So Don and I had about 2.5 hour phone conversation a few weeks ago.
We're going to try to compress it down to
it's
about
gonna be
15
it's gonna be short.
minutes.
We swear to God, because there's no wine up here, so we both want to go get a drink. So we're gonna make this fast.
Really bad.
So some of the stuff I wanted to talk to Don about was because Don and I were in Ireland a year and a half ago or so, and one of the things that was interesting to me to hear about was people who were not old school Apple people, but people that once Next had acquired Apple, management-wise speaking.
What we always describe it as.
Yeah, the reverse takeover. We did the same thing with Disney. And so, what was that like to be an engineer, or project manager engineer out in the real rest of the world, and you're brought into this new Apple, and you're being sort of giving marching orders on technologies from people like Bertrand or Scott Forstall, who had potentially, and I don't know because I didn't work at either of these places, but had a different way of talking about it than Apple people. So how did you come into Apple, and sort of what were you being asked to do?
Well, I came into Apple by being at a failed startup because I'd left Netscape. I've been thrown out of a lot of good companies in the Valley. I was one time or the other. I've been the lead engineer of Macromind Director, the lead engineer of Adobe Illustrator, the lead engineer of Mac Navigator, and I was. Everybody know who Andy Hertzfeld is? Yep. I was working at Andy Hertzfeld's company, Easel, that did the desktop for GNOME. And Bud Tribble was my boss, worked for Bud. It was a great thing. But
four at Next?
Yep. And Easel just augured so hard into the desert floor. I mean, it was grim. And so I told, because Bud wasn't even pulled on the salary when I asked him this. I said, he had the common decency to pay me at the time, though, which was nice. But I said, Bud, my wife's not going to want me to spend the summer again at home. So do you have any leads on a job for your old friend here? We had worked for him for less than a year at the time. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And Andy Hertzfeld lent me a Mac. I had Macs. I had Macs for years because I'd been a Mac programmer on classic OS, and I mean deep classic OS. I still, in my garage somewhere, have hand-commented ROM disassemblies of the toolbox, the OS, and everything. I knew it inside and out. I'm actually trying desperately as possible with either learning new things or drinking them to death to kill the brain cells that know that shit now. But I was deep in that, and I'd become a Linux head, a Unix head, and stuff. And so Andy lent me one of his G3 towers and said, have you looked at? I don't think Cheetah was out yet. This was the Developer 3 preview, because this was the spring of 2000. And I looked at it and I went, they get it. This is what desktop Linux should have been. And I remembered back to the time in the 80s when I went to the first Next developer event. Back in the 80s, the first time I ever met Steve Jobs in person. And that kind of feel, that polish, that excitement, I thought, this is so cool. It's slower than shit, but it's so cool. And I remember that night, I took the machine home, and I would just play with the Finder, and I'd play with terminal.app. They did put terminal on there. And, text edit, and there was all of 2 other apps in the system. And I thought, I got to do this. So I said, Bud, use your connections to get me an interview.
Hook me up, buddy.
Yeah. And at first he thought I wanted to go over and work on the app side. He got me some interview to work on iPhoto, and I was like, no, fuck that. And then I heard that some guy named Scott Forstall wanted to talk to me in system software, and I said, oh, system software, I'll do that. And I went in and talked to Forstall, and he had me sign an NDA and before I could actually talk to him. And I'm in there talking to him, and he's kind of talking around something and describing this. And I was like, so do you want me to build you a web browser? And he said, stop right there. Hold that. He calls in his admin, and she marches in with yet another fucking NDA. I had to sign it, triplicate, everything else. She witnesses. She walks out. We watch her walk out, and Scott turns to me and says, yes. And that's how Safari was born. Now, the funny thing is, all my background, other than going to a NeXTEVNT conference 15 years earlier, I didn't know dick about the new OS, other than playing with it like a user. I didn't know the APIs or anything else. But one of my first meetings with Scott was, please tell me we don't have to do a compatibility later and do this in OS 9. Please tell me it's Cocoa only, because I just, I don't want to go back there. I want the new stuff. This is the future. This is the new stuff. Let's do that. And so Scott and I very early in the process said, yeah, we're not going to do, because back then at that time, Cheetah had just come out. This was in June when I was interviewing with him. And OS 10 was so bad, so incomplete, and so slow. People liked it, but you basically had to reboot into OS 9 multiple times a day to get anything done, because all the apps were on OS 9. Yeah, exactly.
But so talk about that notion of sort of, we're going to the future, we're not looking back. And because isn't like original WebKit stuff like, KDE sort of was that based on stuff that you had been, like technology that you had been seeing when you guys were at Easel and you were in the Linux world and you were?
Oh, yeah, totally. In fact, I made the joke when Scott asked me, because I had worked on Netscape Navigator. I had worked on both of the code bases on Netscape Navigator. I was very familiar with both of them. The original code that they wrote, they started writing when it was just a germ in Illinois, written by Eric Bina and others. And I'd worked on the new code, the code that became Gecko, that's used in Firefox and stuff like that. So I worked on both of them. Very familiar with that. And Scott asked me how I would do it. This was about an hour into the interview, and I was feeling like a real cheeky bastard. And he said, would you use Mozilla? And I said, no, because I know that code really well. It's freaking huge. It's a mess. Both code bases are a mess. What the hell? I'd take the web browser that was in Conqueror, that was KDE's web browser, and I'd use that as a core. And I said that as a joke in the interview. Scott, the thing that was very clear to me, by the way, interviewing with Apple then, that these people had really big brains. I mean, especially, you spend 5 minutes with Bertrand Serlet. Oh my God, is this guy brilliant? But none of them knew a fucking thing about the web, at all. I mean, which surprised me because of web objects and everything else. They didn't know anything about the client, right?
Yeah, because that was all server-side stuff.
Yeah, it was all server-side stuff. And I was like, I was in my first big long interview day when they, marched people through the room to humiliate me. It was like 3/4 of the way into the interview, and I said, "Is anybody going to ask me a really hard question? You know, to prove that I actually know this stuff." So anyway, I said, you know, we'll use KHTML. And so when I did get the job, bullshitted my way into the job and conned another guy in to be on my team. Because, oh, by the way, when I started the team and I hired the original team, I couldn't tell any of them what they were doing.
And how many of those were you hiring from outside versus inside of Apple?
All but one.
From outside of Apple?
Yeah, well, no, I'm sorry. All but two from the original team were outside Apple.
Were outside of Apple.
And what I had to do is I tried to hire old cronies from Netscape. But once they, because you can ask people questions and they can figure, these people weren't stupid. They figured out probably what I was up to if they were going to hire me in for a job here. But they also weren't stupid enough to who's going to do another web browser from the ground up now, Gramps?
Yeah, because remember back then, right? I mean, you know this obviously, but I mean, remember, folks, Internet Explorer owned the universe, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and then Mozilla was
Explorer,
the sort of the upstart, with all the goodness. So why would you write a new one?
And so it was crazy, and Internet Explorer was the browser on the Mac, but and the main reason they wanted to do the thing was, to break that dependence and sloth. I mean, it was also the slowest damn browser in the world. So I had to hire people. My strategy was, it was kind of funny. I had to find really smart people that didn't know it was impossible to do. And I stole a bunch of people from Easel that I'd worked with, which a couple of them turned out to be ex-Apple people. They'd worked back in the old Classic days, and I had to break them no, we're not doing Classic, we're doing the new thing. And they got on the board that real well. And I did manage to get one old Next head, Richard Williamson, and who was the second employee on my team. He was fantastic. And it was the time I got him that we decided we were actually really going to use KHTML and port the thing. Because I'd run out of options. I'd looked at, what was the old, I can't think of the name of it right now. I can't remember who wrote it either. The old web display framework and Next.
The CyberDog stuff?
No, not that. That was the old Classic OS. It was the, yeah, it was, and it was like, I went in and looked at it, and this is somebody who tried to build a web browser on top of RTF, essentially, rich text. And it's
I remember that.
And it's like, holy shit, you're never going to get CSS on top of a stunt like that. So throw that out. So I couldn't use that. I didn't want to use Mozilla because the first employee I had on the team, I had him go out and build. At the time, it wasn't called Firefox. It was just, Mozilla. And look at the code, and I said, what do you think? And it took him a week just to figure out how to build the code, and once he got through XP.com, he said, Gramps, all of their objects have objects. I mean, this is the most abstract, complicated piece of shit. So he was like, we're not using that. I looked at licensing Opera, believe it or not. I actually looked at going begging to Microsoft and licensing what they had and optimize it. But then I pulled the KHTML thing out of my ass again and convinced everybody we could do it. And then 2 months later, Avi asked for a demo.
So tell us how that. I mean, because to me that's part of the culture of the current Apple is so much of a there's a, because this is a Pixar thing too, of here's this date that we have to show it to these people, and these people are going to ask us very hard questions, and we're going to have to sort of survive that crucible. So if you could talk about that, because to me, I don't know if that was around Apple before, but to me, that feels like something that came, sort of with Steve, with sort of Next and Pixar kind of stuff in there, and you've got Bertrand and Avi and Scott.
And basically, I had 3 times, well, maybe 4, where I really thought I was going to get fired. And one was the Avi demo, the next one was the Bertrand demo, and the third one was the real review with Steve. And they were spaced out almost evenly, 6 months apart. And so it was like crisis every 6 months. And by the way, they told me they wanted this thing, the whole browser in I think it was a year. And I knew we couldn't do it in a year, but I figured I had 18 months before they'd fire me.
You always start from when can they fire me and work backwards.
Exactly. So the thing is, I didn't have any frame of reference from the old Apple because I didn't work there. And I didn't have any frame of reference from Next because I didn't work there. I just figured this is the way they do things. And it actually makes sense. Avi wanted to prove that this was worth the additional headcount. Does this guy we hired from the outside know what the hell he's doing? Are they on the right path? Is the right technology choice? And frankly, if it had been for Richard Williamson coming up with, and I didn't know British slang at the time. Richard was born in the UK, and he called it the Spooge Project. Now, I didn't know what the word meant at the time. I only learned. He's got a really evil sense of humor and quite filthy too. So he created the Spooge Project while Ken and I were busy porting the code. And what he did was, and I'll have to go to the audience here, Peter. What was the original X Windows setup on OS X?
Oh, yeah, the Quart stuff.
The Quart stuff?
Well, the X-Quart, or whatever it was.
This is before John rewrote the real one.
The X-Tool stuff, and then there was the...
Yeah, it was... Exactly, it was horrible. And what Richard did is he faked up our code, our modified code, running, because we didn't have the time to hook it into Mac OS X, hooking it in a shim with part of the KDE code running in under X, and then he did some really horrific theming on the X to make it look like OS X at the time. Making it look like Aqua was really hard. And Spooge was the right description for it. It's really horrific. Really horrific. And he showed it to me, and I was like, don't change anything. Do not touch the machine now. It's like, and then I ran off and got Avi and Bertrand and Scott and saved our jobs and the project. And Avi bought it. And then 6 months later, Bertrand was like, okay, you've had, actually it was less than 6 months, it was like 4 months later, show it to me on really running as a real app on OS X. And that's when we actually got into really doing Cocoa stuff. And I was actually being able to, because I was a coding manager at the time, I was actually being able to use all these cool stuff. I sent myself and my team members off to the class, the one they sent the new employees, off to the class to learn the stuff. And I was so excited and everything that we could actually do it. And so we did that half-ass demo and threw away all the code because it was terrible too. And then we got on the real thing. Now, when it comes to doing the demos for Steve, though, that's like taking it to a whole new level. How many of you are familiar with, I think I wrote it in Dalrymple's magazine, and it's still hanging as the first story on my blog because I haven't updated my blog in like a year. Memories of Steve. Has anybody read that? Okay, thank you. You managed to make it through. That's a really long thing. But that's all true. Working in front of Steve was wonderful, exciting, and dangerous.
I think the word you're looking for is terrifying.
It could be terrifying, and one of the first things, and Scott Forstall, bless his heart, he was a great boss, he prepared me for it. He said one of the first things Steve is going to do when you go in and do the demo for him is, he's going to body check you. He's going to see if you've got the stuff. Well, what Steve didn't want is he didn't want yes men around him. He didn't want the easily frightened around him. he didn't want stupid people around him. He wanted people that knew what the fuck they were talking about, and weren't frightened, wouldn't fold under pressure. And by the way, delivered, on what they said. And Scott was like, so no pressure when you go in there. And so Steve did that. I think it was on the second meeting with, did the, you've had him do it to you, right? Where he takes the laser stare, right at you.
Called the Eye of Sauron.
Yeah, Eye of Sauron. And leans in. It's the physics. It's the lean in thing that's really disturbing. And I didn't soil myself. I still can't quite remember what the hell I said, but obviously I didn't sound like a complete moron. So I got to go back, and I learned the other things, when you're sitting there with Steve and you're doing the demo. And this is really true of, the thing is, Steve wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't, at least I think, an asshole or a completely arbitrary person. He was just really busy and really focused. And the way he liked to do design was iteration. He didn't always know what he wanted, but he sure as hell knew what he didn't want. And you had to be ready for that. And you also had to be ready for the way he demoed things. When you were showing him something, and you did the mouse on something, when you were at a pause, you took your hand away. Because if Steve wanted to reach up and take the mouse, you fucking let him take the mouse. You let him drive. You never grab something away from Steve. And you just pray to God your software doesn't crash. And if it ever does crash, you don't make excuses. You just make damn sure that particular crash never happens again. And so I've been in the room there, diplomacy on the second floor. The entire time I was at Apple, that Steve was alive, it was still that same damn room. It's a terrible room. It's designed by a psychotic. I mean, it's just the strangest shape, with these white boards and weird closets and just horrible, horrible decor. I have no idea why. And just terrible lighting, just terrible fluorescent lighting. I don't know why Steve wanted to do it in there. No windows, just claustrophobic and everything. But you were in there, usually in sets of people, and you would take your turn in front of the Eye of Sauron. And, I watched other poor beggars just soil themselves or, just, blather or... And that was, you only saw that happen once because you never saw these people again.
So I think that might be a good ending point. Thank you, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you.